Hi, and welcome to the Debrief. Thanks for joining us this week. I'm Donna King. I'm editor-in-chief of Carolina Journal. Today we're asking this big question. What does a 17th century philosopher have to do with America's modern shutdown, the shutdown that we're seeing at the federal government, and even the way we power our homes? We're going to be talking a lot about that today, about John Locke. And joining us here, we have, of course, we have David Larson, Carolina Journal's managing editor, and from the John Locke Foundation, Mitch Kokai, and then John Sanders from the John Locke Foundation joining us today to talk about energy. So a lot that's going on this week. The federal government's shutdown is stretching into its fourth week, hitting everything from paychecks to food assistance. We're talking a lot about that in all the news. We're going to talk about it kind of in terms of sort of our first principles, some of the things that John Locke has talked about. Let's start with there, actually. The federal government shutdown has exposed how much of our society is really dependent on federal government, things like food stamps, things like that. David, let's talk a little bit about how it's impacting North Carolina specifically.
Well, yeah, we really are so dependent on the federal government.
Right.
There was sort of delineated powers in the U.S. Constitution that had generally thought that most things would be, 10th Amendment.
Sure.
If it's not said here, then everything goes to the individuals and the states. But over time, that's really crept in that, okay, like all these healthcare programs, the majority of babies, as I
Sure.
mentioned in another one, are born on Medicaid.
Yeah.
There's a state-run program, but a lot of federal, input there. And just a lot like SNAP as well. There's a lot of people that live on federal programs, and we saw over COVID that a lot of that grew.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a lot of the impasse here is, the idea of limited government. John Locke was a big influence on our founders, and if we can keep things kind of tight, it's probably easier to agree on things, because if you let it do, runaway train and do whatever anybody wants, and there's only so much money before you go crazy debt and go bust, people aren't going to agree on what to do. And I think we just see impasses at all levels of government just because everybody's relying so much on the government for a variety of things.
Yeah, let's run through some of these numbers. The things that surprised me, I thought they're like just over 84,000 federal employees in North Carolina, which surprised me. But also close to like 600,000 people in North Carolina are on SNAP benefits. And this is something that we've been hearing a lot about, particularly in social media. Mitch, you've been following government spending for decades in your career. What does this tell us about the reach of the federal government and these programs?
Well, the reach of the federal government is far beyond certainly what John Locke would have anticipated.
Sure.
During his day, back in the 17th century, the things were much smaller.
Yeah.
And when you were talking about government overreach, you were talking about the king
Right.
trying to do something that's not even near what's happening now. I saw
Sure.
we were talking before the program started about AI. There was a funny AI version of George Washington joking that I fought a war over a 2% tax, and
Yeah.
you all are accepting what now?
Exactly.
Yes, the federal government reaches far too much into all of our lives. And when you see this federal government shutdown, it really emphasizes that, how many people are relying to such a great extent on the federal government. And I think that's something that certainly would have disturbed John Locke, and I'm sure John Sanders, who has also studied Locke, would have some thoughts about that as well. The idea is you have a community, and the community is the main thing that you should be focusing on. The government has a role to play, but it shouldn't be the government directing everything
Right.
and in charge of everything.
Right.
It's individuals together within a community doing most of their activities as a community, with government not really having anything to do with it, and then leaving to government only those things that government should do and that government alone can do well, which aren't that many.
Sure.
Most things ought to be handled by the civic associations, by families, by private groups interacting with each other, by free market transactions. But when government steps in and does so much, when you reach a political impasse, like we have at this point, over the fact that basically the Democrats in the Senate want the Republicans in the Senate and the House and the administration to lock in a great deal of additional spending that came about because of government mandates. And when the other side doesn't want to do that, then it exposes just how much people are relying on the federal government for things that should be things handled by a state government or by private institutions, civic groups, and we ought to be disturbed about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you, of course, are the director of the Center for Food, Power, and Life, and this is something that we talk about a lot. These are core, fundamental needs that we have in a community. What's your thought as you study this? You've been studying a lot about our food supply, for example, and energy and some of the things that we need so much every day.
Well, I was thinking about what Mitch said when he teed me up a little bit.
Yeah.
But Locke's philosophy was based on government protecting life, liberty, and property.
Sure.
And so where government has its role is in providing that overall umbrella of safety, and then allowing people free enough to do what they're going to do with their own property, with their own resources, including their own person, so where they're going to work, but also how are they going to disperse their money, who is going to, if they want to give to charities that can help with hunger. I mean, like North Carolina, we're probably going to hear a lot about Samaritan's Purse in the coming days because of the hurricane that is afflicting Jamaica. North Carolina is a very excellent organization there that has wonderful knowledge in how to get into communities. They were very helpful during Helene, for example. So we want what Locke wanted was, like Locke envisioned, was a government where it protected people to do these sorts of things. It didn't dictate where people's money was going to go, but that's where our federal government has gone. And so when we have this impasse, it's over who gets to tell you where your money is going to go, or how much money is going to be taken from you.
Sure.
Yeah, and we're talking about Locke, but if you look maybe, it was 130, 140 years after Locke, after the United States had been around for a while, one of the other great thinkers that we rely on, Alexis Tocqueville, looked at how things stood in the United States and the fact that the situation seemed to be much better than it was back in his home country of France or in Europe. And it was because of all the civic associations and people working together in ways that did not involve the government, which what he was used to in France. The king said, I am the state, I am the government, I'll tell you everything that you're going to do. America was very different. And in that time, the time that Tocqueville was writing about and saying that things were really good in America, it was civic associations handling much of what we now think that government should do. And if government doesn't do it, people will get riled up and say, well, why isn't the government doing it, rather than doing it themselves.
Right.
And that's where you're saying is that is one of the problems, is when government takes over an activity that should belong to the private sector, when something happens and government can't do it, then the private sector, most people are, well, what are we going to do? Government's not taking care of it. But that's what people normally would be doing. And so we wouldn't have this wonder about, well, who's going to feed people? How are we going to, who's going to employ people if the government was not taking over so much of that aspect?
Sure.
And I feel like there's a little bit of a creep, because over time people will say, we'll see a little bit of people falling through the margins in a system like that and say, we need a little bit of a social safety net.
Sure.
And I think most people will be like, okay, a little bit, for people who really can't, like somebody with disabilities or somebody, a widow with a bunch of kids or something like that. People will be like, okay, maybe we can do that. But it starts to creep into, okay, able-bodied people who don't have any kids, or when it starts to creep into, I think with SNAP, a lot of things people have had a problem with is they see people, it's kind of fungible a little bit, like, oh, this is for, we think, the taxpayers think, people who really need food or they're going to starve to death.
They're literally starving.
But you see, I was reading, it was a book about Appalachia, maybe from 10 years ago, how it was a common practice when you get your SNAP money, you'd go to a convenience store and they would get pallets of soda and then buy it from them and then rechange it for cash, basically.
Oh, interesting.
They get slightly much less cash than they would get, but same thing happens in...
Is this the J.D. Vance book?
It actually, it was, I think it was called The Great White Ghetto, about Appalachia, and probably was not very nice to the Appalachian culture, but there was also similar things said in bad neighborhoods in big cities, and where they might use that, like trade them, I'll give you $100 of SNAP for $80 of cash.
Right.
But that kind of thing happens, and people wonder also, do they need to buy soda? Do they need to buy sugary things?
Right.
So I think when that kind of thing bubbles up, the social safety net might have gone a bit far, which I don't think, if Locke would have approved of that kind of thing, he wouldn't want it to creep into, okay, now everybody just
Right.
buys whatever they want, even if they don't really need it coming from the taxpayer. They can buy candy bars.
But we can't deny there is a need for some level of social safety net. There's going to be people who absolutely need it. But I think that what it's become has distorted it. Younger generations can't picture what that looks like. What does it look like to have civic groups stepping in, or a state government? Or I think they just can't envision a time when federal government didn't have functions like this.
Well, I think we saw that. You don't have to go all that far back to
Yeah.
see where something like this crops up. Hurricane Helene
Yeah,
hits.
that's a great example.
And as Hurricane Helene hits, some people were saying, all right, what's the government going to do about it?
Nothing. Yeah.
And then other people were saying, what are we going to do about it? Because
Yeah.
we're here, we've got stuff, we know where there are problems.
It is the community,
Let's
yeah.
start doing things. And other people were saying, well, what about the government? Why is it FEMA here? And
Right.
that's because you have this mindset that the government is supposed to step in and do these things.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not something in the long term that's beneficial for your society when people, as John was talking about earlier, sit back and say, what are we going to do? The government's not doing this anymore.
I think federalism is also important here in that, as close as you can get, if you're going to use government, don't have it be FEMA way far away. Try to get it as close as you can to the people so they can keep you
communities.
accountable. They can vote for you rather than
Sure.
big
That's-
national structures.
That's an excellent point too, because some of the local community charities that work with people who have needs, they can see them on an individual basis, whereas the government has a checkbox. Did we give them this amount of money? Did we give them this amount of service? Whereas someone who knows you in the community can look at you and say, actually, you need some soft skills. You need to work on this part of your life. So yeah, we'll make sure you got some food, but let's help you learn a little bit about timeliness and about personal appearance and how to be polite.
Budgeting and
Yeah, and
basics.
right. So those are the sorts of things that you can't get really from a government top-down program, whereas you can get from someone in your community who cares about you and who knows you and your
So you're talking
needs.
about a more holistic approach,
Right,
that when
right.
you get down to a community level, you have the access to the recipient to provide more holistic support.
Right.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and the idea of that David was talking about a little bit earlier, which does involve federalism, but
Yeah.
that's sort of limited to the government piece of it. Another way to think about it is the subsidiarity. Don't allow a decision about something important to go beyond the level of the society that it needs to be handled in. So
Right.
if something can be handled completely locally, don't get the state or don't get the federal government involved, leave it to the locals.
But what would that look like? Would that go through our state agencies? Would it, like in a practical standard, what does that look like? I don't even think we know anymore.
Few people do
Yeah.
know, but there are some things that can be handled completely locally.
Yeah.
And don't have to have the government involved.
Sure.
I mean, that's what we do when we have our free market transactions.
Right.
I mean, you don't have to have the government tell you, go to this grocery store
Yeah.
on this day and buy this. No, there's a grocery store.
Right.
You go and you
Right.
buy when you need to buy groceries from it. And there are still large parts of our lives where it is market transactions
Sure.
that have developed over centuries or
Yeah.
millennia. But there are things that more and more are dictated by government, and as John said earlier, once the government starts dictating it, people lose their ability to comprehend how you would act without the government being involved.
Sure.
And John Locke, I'm suspecting, if
Yeah.
he didn't die of shock of everything else that he saw hundreds of years after his death, he would look at the way the government operates and think, that's not what I was talking about.
Right. I wonder if we need to do like an AI video series of him reacting to things.
That'd be a good idea. Yeah, I think part of the problem too is that there were so many other civic groups that had existed that the reason maybe we can't think of what would this look like sometimes is it was a much thicker society. Another rival conservative philosopher, Edmund Burke, talked about the little platoons, and though we used to have a ton of those. That's what Alexis de Tocqueville was talking about when he walked around. He would see all of these different organizations that would pop up. Oh, we have a problem in our town about this. Some charitable group would pop up to handle it, and he was very impressed by that. But I think we've emptied out a lot of that, and we have kind of, a lot of people follow only national news. They only care about big picture things, and they're not really as plugged in to really fill out that civic space like we used to.
Yeah, and I think some of it, though, also is the loss of church communities and family structures and multi-generational living. The way we live isn't conducive to that, and unfortunately, and I think that we've lost some of that sense of, your children are partially being raised by grandparents and great-grandparents, and neighbors know each other, and but Helene is a great example. When that happened, where did people go first? They went to their churches. They went to their churches. They went to the local school, the local neighbors, volunteer fire groups. Those kind of groups are the ones that stepped into the gap when that happened because the government wasn't there.
Yeah, and another thing that we ought to throw out there is that some of the changes with the lack of groups or people getting together is the way we live our lives, with so many people just spending their time looking at a phone all day and not interacting with other people.
Sure.
I mean, there's so many fewer opportunities for people to just get together and interact with people who are different than you are in many different ways, which is another reason for the political polarization.
Yeah.
Most of the people that people know are the people who they deal with on a day in, day out basis because they work with them, because they interact with them online, and they're not people who you just might meet who would be in a completely different situation than you and have different attitudes, but you can meet that person and say, oh, I didn't know that. I don't maybe necessarily agree, but I understand where you're coming from and your perspective, and I'm not going to hate you because we're different and think different things.
Right.
I was going to say, Helene was an example of what can go right, I think, when you have all those groups, but it was also an example of the people who were not plugged in to those, because there's a lot of retirees that moved to the mountains, to places like Highlands, and and those were the people that were the most, because nobody, if you're not plugged into a community and you're new to the area, those are the people who, they retired and had a big house up on the hill and nobody knew they were there. If you're not plugged in, it can be kind of dangerous to not have those connections.
Sure. And the tension between government responsibility and individual liberty, we're seeing this in lots of different ways, even in how we keep the lights on, right? So you have a new piece out. Make sure you go over to johnlocke.org and read this, because John has a new story, a new piece up about some changes that we're seeing in North Carolina's energy future and how our grid's going to operate. This could really be big things for North Carolina.
I think so, yes.
Walk us through it.
It's funny we're talking about government here, but with respect to power supply in North Carolina and how we power our homes, we have to deal with a government-blessed monopoly.
Right.
So everything about free markets is pretty much not applicable to the way that we do power provision in North Carolina and pretty much the United States. It goes back to the very beginning, where it was thought that the ability to power homes and provide power through a grid and everything was just too much to leave to the free market. So we decided to call it a natural monopoly. So that's why it's set up that way.
Okay.
Because it's set up that way, politics gets involved quite a bit. And in recent years, we've had a lot of political choices regarding our electricity supply. We had the carbon plan that was passed and then implemented in 2022 that allowed, that required our power provision, and I'm speaking about Duke Energy because they're over 90% of the state, so in terms of their customers. So Duke has to, originally in the law, had to get 70% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions from where they were in 2005. That's always a big thing to write, so I have to spit it out as fast as possible. That was called the interim goal, with the ultimate goal being by 2050 getting to carbon neutrality, whereas we're not producing any carbon dioxide emissions and generating electricity.
Because it stops at the state line, I guess.
Yeah, that would be a whole nother show.
Right.
So the way that it was implemented, the law was originally passed with guardrails to say yes, but whatever the path that we choose, and so let me back up. I'm talking way too much. So Duke has to provide a plan to the Utilities Commission every 2 years, basically, and the Utilities Commission then decides is this the proper plan, and then provides an order saying here's how you're going to go about it, and then every 2 years they update it depending on what changes and what they anticipate. So the previous plan had some changes in law that were affected by the possibility of new natural gas supplies.
Okay.
That possibility is now more of a very strong likelihood. So because of that, we can have a little bit more access to natural gas. However, because of the interim goals effect and the time it takes to build natural gas, essentially it was not allowing for much natural gas provision. The interim goal kind of enforced a linearity in the reduction of carbon dioxide emissions.
Okay.
So it was shown to the state General Assembly that the interim goal was having a far outsized effect on the modeling, to the extent that it was probably going to cost consumers about $13 billion more, which was against the provisions in the law to provide the least cost path that maintains reliability and be reasonable. So with that, and with some other changes, including the Trump administration coming in and putting it into some of the IRA tax credits, putting it into actually calling into account all of these wind, offshore wind projects that they had, including 2 that were planned off North Carolina. Duke, in the meantime, had a third-party study look at it and find that this is before. Anyway, they found that offshore wind just wasn't going to be
Sure.
efficient at all and cost effective. So they're getting out of offshore wind. And then over the summer, Senate Bill 266 was passed that repealed the interim goal because it was having such a bad effect. All those things changed. So in October, at the beginning of October, Duke came out with a new plan, as they were supposed to, which would include 59% more nuclear and natural gas than they had in the previous plan. So that's a significant amount of new, reliable electricity provision by 2040.
That's exciting. I mean, I think it means a lot for North Carolina's economy, certainly, right?
I think it would be good. The other impact it would have was it would allow for a more graduated closure of coals, of our coal plants. So we're not getting rid of our reliable coal plants quite as quickly. And we saw why that was important over the summer when we had a super heat wave that was so bad that Duke went to the Department of Energy and asked for an emergency order to allow them to get out from under their emissions requirements so that they could keep the power on. They got it, and they were able to increase their provision of power from coal by 30%. And that allowed the power to stay on. We didn't have like another blackout event like we did in Christmas Eve a couple of years ago.
We've been thinking about that actually. 2022, I think it was. We had a blackout on Christmas Eve.
Right.
Does this indicate that they're going to have a little more flexibility in helping us keep the lights on as we move forward?
I'm hopeful. There was a Department of Energy study that came out that said that for North Carolina and South Carolina, without any changes, then our risk for blackouts was going to be up by 27 times by 2030. So I'm hopeful that being able to make some changes will allow us to not be in quite such a risky environment.
Sure, sure. Yeah, we were talking
remember,
about
this is not entirely in Duke's hands. This
Right.
is Duke's plan, but as John was saying, it goes to government regulators because government has said,
exactly what I was gonna ask you. Is
you
this-
have this
yeah.
monopoly, and so you get the chance to conduct this business, but we're going to tell you some of the guardrails of what you're able to do, and this is up to North Carolina's Utilities Commission, which has in recent years been very friendly toward not the reliable sources,
Right.
the coal and the natural gas and the nuclear, but much more interested in solar power,
Sure.
which John can spend the next 2.5 hours telling you about why solar power is not as reliable as those other sources. So it remains to be seen whether the Utilities Commission, even though it has had a recent change in membership, whether that commission is going to have 3 of its 5 votes at least being supportive of what Duke wants to do, or if they go back and say, no, we want solar and you got to stick with solar, and so scale back some of this coal and natural gas stuff and make sure that you emphasize solar. It's going to be a political decision,
Right.
because this is all political, because it's all left to the government rather than the free market.
Sure, sure.
One interesting dynamic we don't always talk about, but I think, you know, you touched on it, that it was determined to be sort of a monopoly type of system. This is the only way it can operate. But maybe one factor about solar, obviously it's not as efficient, it's more expensive. And so I personally like the fact that there's more nuclear and natural gas, but one thing I do like about solar as a trend is that it would have pushed back against that a little bit of the monopoly, where each individual home can kind of set up their own power generation. So it would be an interesting development if in the future,
were,
maybe not
yeah.
solar, but maybe something else, maybe, I don't know if you have like micro reactors,
Well, that's the question,
but
right? Is that in the
something
future?
that would let it be more individualized, so you could actually have competition between companies. You could have, you know, the consumer at their house could say, we want this kind of power,
Right.
whatever, because solar gives a little bit of a window to that future, but it just, you know, wasn't necessarily what we need right now. But I did like maybe that one part of it.
It is exciting, the idea of these individual or small nuclear reactors. Do you think that's where it's headed, so people can individually control their energy?
It's possible.
Okay.
There's so much innovation that's possible
Sure.
out there that it's hard to see where things could go. Duke makes allowance for, by 2040, seeing hydrogen fuel maybe taking over in some places.
Interesting.
Some of their coal plants are that are being kept open. The ones that are being kept open the longest are the ones that they consider dual fuel, which can transition into natural gas plants. So who knows what could be done
Right.
with carbon capture. If we can do that, then maybe the coal plants can stay open longer. There are 2 companies in North Carolina that have federal grants that are looking into it. And if they're able to scrub the carbon emissions from not only power plants, but from these big industrial sites, you know, that can be sold. It can be used for hydraulic fracturing. It can
Sure.
be used. They can be sold to companies that make carbonated beverages. You know, who knows?
Yeah.
The main thing is to not lock us into a future where we are stuck with extremely expensive, overbuilt resources, which is one of my worries about solar. The new plan still has a tremendous amount of solar. The difference really is that it's adding a significant amount of new reliable resources. But what the plan has for now is by 2040, the amount of solar on our grid to quadruple, nearly quadruple.
I guess I wasn't clear. I was talking about the rooftop solar, not
Yeah,
the
yeah.
solar
Right,
farms.
right,
Sure,
yeah.
sure.
Rooftop solar, I was saying maybe, you know, there could be other
I didn't know if you
forms
meant
of-
like community
Yeah.
solar, but
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
another form. And
There could be individualized systems,
Right.
other ways maybe
Yes.
that could maybe
It
break the
is.
utility effect.
Yeah.
and then
yeah.
it
It
could,
is.
and it can come in handy in small doses, definitely, and for local communities, for, you know, like local neighborhoods when I say
Sure,
communities.
sure. This is all about individual
yeah.
choice and freedom.
Yeah.
And we're going to be, as we go into the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, we're going to be talking more and more about these core principles, these first principles from people like John Locke. Thanks so much for joining us. Make sure you check out carolinajournal.com and johnlocke.org for more.